Vanakkam, good evening. It's both an honor and a sad duty to chair this Bani Bhet Memorial Lecture. Bani Bhet was a dear friend of many of us. Bani was a Pachai Tamil, a true Tamil who, by the accident of birth, was an American. He was very passionate about the Tamil language, had a long engagement with Tamil and the Tamil people. He considered Madurai his second home, right from the early 1980s until his untimely and sudden death. He engaged closely with Tamil society, and he had so many friends among Tamils. He was born in 1960, and as I said, he came to Tamil Nadu first in the early 80s. I think he came on the Wisconsin Year in India program. And he lived in Madurai for many, many years. I think he did his undergraduation in Hobart College, and then he came to Chicago. And Chicago was his home for more than a decade and a half, where he completed his PhD. He also taught Tamil there. And then he taught at Yale University for about 10 years. And before he died, he joined Yale NUS College. He was a very inspirational teacher. He gave a lot of time to his students, as many of us would know. In fact, that also came in the way of his writing. I know many students undergraduate students, who decided to take up academics because of Bani. Many in Tamil Nadu knew him as the white man who was studying platform Tamil, public speaking in Tamil. So his first book, Tamil Oratory and Dravidian Aesthetic, is a great work of scholarship, which is basically an ethnography of Tamil public speaking. It was published some years ago in 2009 by Columbia University Press, and then the Indian edition from OUP. I knew him for more than 25 years. He was a very dear friend, and I must say that he was writing his second book, which is also, it resonates to the title of today's lecture. I was pushing him to do a history of public speaking in Tamil, and he took it on with great alacrity, and over the last 10-15 years, he worked extensively on it. He published a few papers, and he was very close to finishing the manuscript. Thankfully, his son and some of his friends have actually salvaged the manuscript. We are looking at it, and hopefully it will be published. I'm both happy and sad to mention that, when we looked at the manuscript, the notes for the preliminary pages, the manuscript is dedicated to me, and I'm honored but also feel a lump in my throat. It is most appropriate that we should commemorate his memory here. There is no better occasion to do this than a centenary assessment of the Dravidian Movement, and no better person to deliver this lecture. I'll not be presumptuous enough to introduce Sudipta Kaviraj to this audience. It is actually me who requires an introduction. But I'll just say one line, is that Bani had a great respect for Sudipta and his scholarship, and in the last years, he engaged with his writing extensively. I remember the vernacular public sphere conference in Yale that he organized, where Sudipta was there all through the conference, and he was commenting on each and every paper. And there were many occasions whenever we were discussing, he would say, look up that paper by Sudipta, read this paper by Sudipta. That's what he used to say. So the most appropriate person to give this lecture, and a most apposite title for today's talk. We look forward to it, Sudipta. Thank you.
It's an inversion of the natural order for me to give a lecture in the memory of Barnard Bate. He was a close friend. I had enormous respect for him. And in the first part of my lecture, I would reminisce a little bit about my relation with Barney, because I think people like him are very special. We all felt, quite devastated at the news that, he passed away like that. I knew him for a very long time. Whenever I visited Chicago, we met. And then when he was at Yale, we met very often because he used to come to New York. And I think during that time, I also invited him to teach in our department for a year. So, and we also have common interests in politics and political oratory. So I hope that would actually come out in what I say. So Barney was a real radical and showed the exemplary courage of nonconformism. To be radical is to have the courage to do otherwise than what is expected of you. We live in a strange climate of expanding immodesty and ingratitude. Individuals like Barney are successors to people like Charlie Andrews, who in the days of the imperialist dominance decided to side with the colonial peoples. True, now we have independence, but the asymmetry in cultural power between the West and other cultures has not appreciably diminished. We need to be humble and feel grateful to these people who were highly intelligent, utterly curious about the world. But instead of examining their own culture, which they could do, decided to explore the mysterious charms of a distant language, its semantics, its diction, and its strangely captivating oral world. If we read, the best representatives of this kind of gratuitous contribution to the knowledge of our society, Barnard Bate, David Shulman, Sheldon Pollock, it becomes clear that not merely do they contribute to augmenting the knowledge of the societies we study jointly with them, but they also bring, because of their starting out as outsiders, angles of vision that are often obstructed to us. It's important for us to realize, to analyze and understand the cognitive process in which these exceptional individuals take part. Yesterday, Partha's talk celebrated the work of another exceptional scholar of Tamil politics, who brought to bear on it the kind of sensitivity and fine vision that only a sensitive insider can possess. Today, we are celebrating the life of another unusual individual who began as an outsider. It's important to discuss the questions of insider and outsider today, particularly because of what is happening around us. Inside and outside locations are complex and need close examination. The contrastive cases of Barney and Pandian illustrate something vital in the life of the mind when that mind seeks to understand societies. Scholars who are insiders, because they come from the culture they study, speak without effort the language in which their texts are written, possess both advantages and disadvantages. I realize quite often that the very nearness and iterativeness of some of Tagore's lines makes me blind to their complexities. It's only when I try to use them in teaching students from across the world, where I cannot take the lines for granted, that I suddenly realized unnoticed complexities of meaning. That is why translation is good for those who do not need translation to read the text. To understand many parts of the textual world, we have to estrange them, to defamiliarize them, set them somewhat apart from the close linguistic bond. On the other hand, the outsider like Barney has to cross many thresholds of outsiderness, acquiring the skills in a foreign language, familiarizing oneself with an utterly dissimilar culture, internalizing an iconic vocabulary with exceptionally wise gods with 4 faces, exceptionally powerful demons with 10 heads, and invincible goddesses with 10 arms, riding without much observable discomfort on a bounding lion. Gradually, through these works of effort, the scholar enters this world and comes to live inside it, and because of his outsider's eye, seeing often more things than we do, with our jaded, overfamiliar vision of this cultural world. Instead of contesting their title to study our world alongside us, we should, if we are civilized, thank them for making our world their own. We should not treat them for their gifts with malice, but with gratitude. Barnard Bate was an outsider who never left, and in our lighter exchanges, he would often show the different styles of enunciation of great individual Tamil speakers. I'm a Bengali who should have easier access in principle to the world of Tamil words because I'm an Indian than an American. But people like me have to be taken by the hand like children into that world by people like Barney, who learned to transcend through their scholarship their cultural selves. Barney and I had a subject of discussion to which we often returned. Does linguisticality happen differently in English and in the vernacular? Do language events happen in different ways in the vernaculars? We often wondered at the many-sidedness of our Indian linguistic world. It is its most explicit diversity that I usually noticed, the fact of so many different languages existing side by side, or often on top of one another. But most often, our existence itself puts to doubt the assumption that has been given an aura of self-evidence by 200 years of European nation-states, that human beings are single-language individuals. Just as the dog barks and a cow moves, human beings speak Tamil or English. We do not know if among dogs there is a more polished accent of barking, but our linguistic world is full of complex differentiation because words sound, and we can and do deliberately make them sound in innumerably different ways. There's a sound aspect of pronunciation, an aspect of aspiration, an aspect of rising and lowering of tone. Even a philosopher as fair as Frege makes an initial distinction between 2 aspects of words or language, between sense and tone. I will go on and try to make a further distinction in the tone itself. Sense is the part concerned with the meaning-bearing function of words. Everything else for Frege is tone. But tone itself can be subdivided into 2 layers. One can be called a writing tone, and one can be called a writing tone. Hobbes' tone, for instance, is adversarial to his enemies. Locke's tone is reasonable. Hobbes constantly makes fun of Christian believers and thinkers. Locke starts from the perfectly Christian premise that the earth and all its fruits are given to men in common. But he shepherds his subsequent argument to a point that a Christian and a pre-capitalist era would find unrecognizable and shocking. But his tone is not to alienate, but to cajole. Among BJP orators of our times, Modi has a divisive tone. Vajpayee had a reasonable tone. This is an aspect of our world of words that we hardly ever analyze, and I often deplore this with Barney. Barney organized in his last years at Yale an exceptionally interesting conference at which Chalapati was present. Was there anyone else from here in that conference? No, probably not. An exceptionally interesting conference on the vernacular public sphere. You were there. Sorry about that. His originality of mind was demonstrated by the manner he guided the attention of the conference. We not merely noticed and discussed the sheer presence of public spheres of Tamil and Urdu, the 2 languages that featured prominently. Of course, each of these languages have their peculiar cultural history, without which we cannot begin to understand them. But to me, the other highly unusual feature of the conference was an interesting discussion we had on the idea of the public in the notion of the public sphere. To any historically minded scholar, it's evident that most dissimilarly structured societies have some kind of public sphere, some institutional space or space-like entity on and through which ideas are communicated and exchanged. Clearly, however, the manner in which these were public differed significantly, and we concluded that our collective task as scholars was neither to force the Indian forms of publicity into Habermas's fairly historically innocent conception, or to tinker with it sufficiently to make it shapeless enough to accommodate the Indian modern and pre-modern historical instances. The grounds in front of the temple, the Greek agora, the res publica of the Romans, the city squares where Savonarolas could be burnt at stake, the coffee houses in revolutionary Paris, the petitioners to the American Senate, the streets of Kolkata where huge demonstrations paralyzed the frantic city, these all figured in our discussions, and we recognized the distinctive forms of publicity. And we refused the seductive call of some universalized form which could explain all history of human beings trying to make contact with each other. We remained content, in Barney's spirit, to observe the peculiarities and call them all public in their highly distinctive ways. He was in that sense an exemplary instance of how historical social science ought to be practiced, deeply embedded in language and its power and playfulness, at home in a culture and its deep historical interiority, refusing universalistic conceits. It is shocking how little we know about what we claim to know. Political scientists, of course, claim individually and collectively to know a great deal about the activity called politics. Politics, if treated as a single activity, is of course obviously many-sided and can be analytically decomposed into several constituent activities. Political activity is evidently carried out in and through language, but it's startling how analytically inert this particular use of the idea of language is. As I often read and think about literature, that does not allow me to be deaf to what Frege called the tone, to the outside of the language or the surface of the language. When we read literature, we cannot remain contented with just semantics. We have to develop a much more many-sided awareness about language, to be aware of the imagery, of the rhymes, the internal poetic rhythms. There is a social science conceit which implies that these are all external aspects, implying within that statement that these are secondary. But quite often, highly successful poetry is also in a sense devoid of content. Similarly, using Frege's preliminary description, I have a section which I want to develop more, which would discuss the philosophical ideas a little bit more. Let me simply make a couple of remarks about that. I would like to start with the distinction that you have in Frege between meaning and tone. For him, meaning is that side of language which makes propositions and about which you can say true and false. Everything else is tone. I think if we want to understand oratory and the sound aspect of language, we need to give attention to a point that is made very forcefully by Derrida, which is essentially that language happens differently in writing and in speaking. Both are linguistic, both are language, but the work of language happens very differently there. But I think we need to go beyond that by making a distinction between ordinary speech and oratorical speech and devote some attention to criteria by which we can separate what is ordinary speech making from what is oratorical. I'm also struck by the fact that Austin's very influential work, How to Do Things with Words, how meaning-sided it is. It proceeds as if we can do various things with only the semantics of the words and not the tonal side. So a crucial task is to understand precisely the exact ways in which speech is enhanced in the oratorical. I find that Indian theories, by contrast, are far more curious about sound, and it does not suppress the oral aspect to a philosophical secondariness. In Bengali, derived from the Sanskrit source, Shabda, as it does in Sanskrit, means both the word and the sound. Since Shabda is an abstract and generic term, it means sound in general in its most comprehensive sense. Following this first step, it's interesting to explore whether we can accord to the sound some kind of priority. And if we can, in exactly what sense. First, there is the temporal priority of the sound. We have to hear or see the word before we get to its meaning. Modern reading, in that sense, impoverishes our relationship to the world of words. It turns off the shabda, making it unnaturally silent, the way we read books or the way we read poetry, etc. The activity of politics restores to words this essential but silenced attribute. But it is also clear that communication remains incomplete or meaningless if that semantic side is not ignited. Someone might utter a Japanese sentence to me in an oral sense, as long as I hear it correctly without distortion, I've heard it. But it's not communicated fully to me as long as I remain oblivious to its meaning. There's a section in which I argue that here I think I probably have a slight difference with Barney, that it's a great mistake to think of rhetoric as empty. I think it leads to a category mistake. Rhetoric is never empty, or to be more provocative, emptiness is the constitutive character of rhetoric. It's a strange quality of language which can be effective, even when there is no meaning. It carries no meaning. Pure rhetoric in that sense is purely empty, but that is precisely its character. And even when it is empty in that sense, it's still very powerful. Now, I'll now turn to oratory in my vernacular, which is Bengali. Political speech in Bengal originates, like most other beginnings, with Ram Mohan Roy. If we consider the distinction I made earlier between a more writing-oriented tone and a more oral tone, Ram Mohan Roy's writings on religious controversy display a really Hobbesian kind of tone, acerbic, adversarial, radical, determined to shake the certainties of the conventional Hindus by asking them questions laden with a kind of contempt. The interrogative form contains a mark of minimal respect or civility. It's not calling them names or using expletives, but it's working at a boundary of declared disrespect that is just barely short of that line. Ram Mohan Roy's adversaries are bound to be stung, humiliated by insistent disrespect directed at them, asking them how, as minimally rational beings, they could, in a favored locution, play with mere dolls. For instance, he says in Bangla all the time, Putla loya khela koro, that is, how do you play with dolls? I give Roy's example because if we undertake a study like Barney's on Bengali oratorical history, we would have to contend with a long period before mechanical recording becomes possible. Surely there is a relation of adequation between the semantic tone and the vocal tone, though at times excellent orators could also use a deliberately contradictory relation between the oral tone and the semantic force. Insults are at times more cutting if delivered in a tone of great, unexcitable courtesy. Now I offer a kind of short history of political speech in Bangla. I want to present an outline of what a short history of Bengali oratory could look like. Oratory becomes a potent force only with the arrival of modern politics. I understand the qualifications. In pre-modern societies also there are certain settings where oratory is required. For instance, if you look at settings of war, think of some of the Shakespeare plays where the great generals actually come out with great oratorical performances. But I'm thinking essentially of the modern world. And even there, in two stages of representative politics, oratory can have two different forms. Modern politics originates often in a cameral form. I call it a cameral form to indicate that it is something which is delivered in a closed space, in a kind of face-to-face situation. So speaking in a hall, let's say in Calcutta, in the middle of the 19th century, would be speaking in a cameral form. Whereas speaking in a street or speaking in a big public meeting in the Maidan, open Maidan, I think is a very different kind of oratorical setting. So cameral form, where speakers inside a legislative or deliberative chamber to a relatively small group of their peers, who usually have the same level of education and linguistic skills. Legislative speaking in India in initial stages was of this kind, but speeches in legislature were to be supplemented ordinarily with the shaping of public opinion. Usually the scenes of this crucial activity was in public meetings where again a stable condition was the cultural homogeneity of the speaker and the audience. Surendranath Banerjee, who was a great speaker, was a great orator of this historical stage. He spoke in English, apparently with excellent diction, flawless grammar, seeking to sway his audience to his view through the reasoning of his speeches. But from historical record, it appears that there's a crucial change in the coming of the first mass movement, with the Swadeshi agitation of 1905. First, the mass character of the movement inevitably and irretrievably transformed the sociological formation of political mobilization. Utterly dissimilar classes became part of a single agential body, at least transiently. Mass movements arose only when the sectional dissatisfaction of the modernist elite began to either infect the peasantry and other subaltern groups, or their quite dissimilar discontents began to draw sympathy from the politicized elite. Connection between these socially divergent groups required mutual persuasion. The peasantry needed to be convinced that they needed to shed their blood for the capture of an abstract sovereignty from which they could expect to gain little tangible benefits. Members of the modern elite had to be convinced that the poverty of the peasants, artisans, and lower classes in general were in some sense their concern as well. I believe that we require the theoretical difference between the two beings of language in speech and writing to explain the conditions of possibility of the Gandhian mass movement. We take for granted the partially valid platitude that language is a means of communication. But obviously, that statement needs to be qualified seriously. Language is filled with cracks and fissures. It's full of internal distances, persistent misunderstandings, and radical possibilities of incommunication. Sometimes incommunication happens when we do not want to communicate, but we still speak. As, for instance, if we want to hide something from children, we would switch to a different language, like speaking in English. And sometimes incommunication just happens in the sense that we do not intend it, but it happens. I think that the circulation of ideas that made our nationalist mass movements possible depended almost entirely on language in its speech form, on people who could communicate ideas to ordinary illiterate people and give them, despite their formal illiteracy, the dignity of political participation. The real history of our national movement lies not in the history of nationalist writing, but in the intangible realm of nationalist speech-making. In Bengal, Swadeshi gave birth to the first generation of political speakers at mass meetings. The character of the meetings were transformed. If I did it up a bit more fully, I would have to do something like what Barney does, wonderfully in his book, describing the setting in which the stage and the setting in which the speech is given. The character of the meetings were transformed from a gathering of well-heeled elite members in Kolkata's aristocratic halls. The political meeting came down to the streets, which were the only venue capacious and public enough to admit the vast numbers of the Swadeshi mobilizations. From the evidence of textualized speech, because I want to emphasize that this is actually the paradox of history, that there are many things that we can know, but there are also certain other things which we would never know. For instance, we would never know the tone of, let's say, Ram Mohan Roy's voice, or how somebody actually made a speech in Calcutta's Albert Hall, which is irrecoverable. So I think we should actually learn to regret that kind of thing, which is lost in history. So from the evidence of textualized speeches, it seems that the language of speech, speech-making, also shifts discernibly in two different ways. The new breed of orators were quite unlike the legislative and cameral speakers of the earlier stage, who were skilled in tight reasoning, laconic presentation, witty exchanges, clever repartees, absorbing in its entirety the internal aesthetic values of good speech-making in British parliamentary settings. I think that kind of witticism, that form of wit, was not very common in vernacular writing or speech-making. And clearly, its technical aesthetic values were taken from English, as the speeches were delivered in English language. Audiences marveled at the speaker's fluency and grace in speaking a language that was not his own. All this changed at one stroke with the Swadeshi movement. Speeches by leaders like Bipin Chandra Pal were aesthetically vastly different, particularly in two respects. At the time of Swadeshi political agents, at the time of Swadeshi, political agents did not work inside democratic institutions, but the activity of politics itself began to be democratized in subtle ways. It was no longer confined to the English-educated elites. Anyone from the lower middle classes, and in exceptional circumstances from the workers of the peasantry, could become significant political leaders. They addressed large meetings of a much less educated audience. So increasingly, political speech-making, turned to the vernacular to make communication with ordinary people possible. Vernacularity altered some of the constitutive features of political speeches. Comparing speeches by the liberal, moderate constitutionalist leaders like Surendranath Banerjee and their contemporary extremist leaders like Bipin Pal is instructive, because this exercise shows how, as the content of political demands change, so does the tone of speaking of those ideas. Speeches now contain a different, more vernacular rhetoric, employing techniques of enhancement of language familiar through poetic practices like alliteration, repetitive emphasis, but most significantly, this language is permeated now with an iconic repertoire drawn from local religion, reference to Kali or Krishna. Pal famously wrote that to understand India, people had to understand the figure of Krishna. In the earlier liberal speeches, there was a clear rejection of the religious, particularly the messy, irrational, atavistic religions of the place, though sophisticated deployment of Christian rationalistic imagery was permitted. In the Swadeshi phase, the language of political negotiations that resembled a game of chess is slowly replaced by a language of blood and sacrifice, because the nation or the people, which is waking from its long historical sleep, is engaged in a much deadlier game of conquest and freedom. Banerjee was interested, it now seems, in merely outwitting the British or persuading to offer more places on the Viceroy's Council. Pal gradually speaks of an apocalyptic language of conquest and emancipation, of defeat and victory, not simply outwitting the British in a game of their making, but destroying their imperial edifice and planting the national flag on its ruins, though without much clarity about what to build on its vast vacated space. To my mind, this is my personal prejudice, even in this transformation of language, speech, and affect, my favorite dissenter, Bankim Chatterjee, played a vital part by exhorting his deracinated, anglicized, rationalistic countrymen to learn to worship their language, visualize their country as a woman and mother, so she is both vulnerable and invincible, immediately allowing, or rather inviting, the deeply emotive iconography of Durga and Kali to be deployed in an unreconstructed Sanskritic vocabulary of the stotras. But from the preliminary description itself, you can see the slow possibility of a problem arising. As I said, the extremists, despite their negative enthusiasm, were vague about what to construct in place of the destroyed empire. This expanding eloquence was also in another sense quite empty and could be accused by more realistic politicians of irresponsible bombast. I'm actually quite interested by this question of emptiness of rhetoric. And it has to be fleshed out much more than what I've done here. This expanding eloquence was also in another sense quite empty and could be accused by more realistic politicians of irresponsible bombast, of imitating the power of poetry too closely, which was misleading because it's not the task of poetry to build constitutions and provide governance and write laws. Stubbornly prosaic tasks which remained unaddressed if political speech spoke only the language of poetry. I think partly in response to this affective, poetic, enthusiastic strand, which comes from Bankim, or working on material from Bankim, of both thought and oratoric expression, another strand emerged which found a very different model of enhanced speech, whose values were entirely different from this one. That alternative model sought to go back to some of the aesthetic values of the older style, of precision, conciseness, unsentimentality, but which also allowed itself the sparse decoration of occasional wit. We all know of Gandhi's astonishing ability of sparking repartee, like his quips about the king wearing clothes enough for two people, or Western civilization being a good idea. In his speech manner, there was a conviction that he was speaking what was the truth for himself, and it was the force of that truth which would convince people. It did not need additional assistance from rhetorical embellishment. Nehru was an interesting example, always less laconic than Gandhi, often florid, when he is oratorical, as in the tryst with destiny, which lifts the speech from out of the ordinary. What lifts the speech from out of the ordinary is the selection of the semantically striking phrase, rather than a sustained delivery of colorful phrasing or the affective color of his voice. I want to end my very inadequate discussion of Bengali oratory by noting some features of communist speech making in the 60s. When I first heard these speeches, I suspect I must say, in the spirit of the times, grandly, when I was constituted as a political subject, with its double formation of the freedom of subjectivity and the inevitability of subjection. The nature of communist politics was complex, holding in an inextricable junction two entirely divergent demands on acting speech, that is, the speech that acts. At least their own image of communist politics was of a deeply ratiocinative intellectual activity whose intellectual complexities has to speak in prose. Yet it also contained an irreducible element of emancipatory fervor, which demanded struggle and sacrifice, and therefore needed the exhortative language of poetry on the other side. Communist speechmaking could be divided into two contrastive styles. The first, more the style of Nehru and Ambedkar, Ambedkar's sort of speech of reason, was represented by Somnath Lahiri among the Bengali communists, as an example. He was the lone communist member of the Constituent Assembly and was a regular and effective speaker there. Laconic, acerbic, often with a biting wit, normally directed against the contemptible representatives of the feudal and the bourgeois classes, passing off a repackaging of colonial subjection in the fraudulent language of political liberty. Subsequently, in Indian Parliament, S.A. Dange often practiced this kind of speech practice in English. At least that's what I feel reading reading him in English, though I have no means of judging his Marathi oratory. But he was apparently a very powerful Marathi orator as well. By contrast, speeches, for instance, by Hiren Mukherjee sound excessively professorial, excessively laden with European historical and literary references, and of course plain verbosity. Lahiri also had the startling ability to transfer the aesthetic rhetorical values of his English speech making in Bengali as well. He managed to maintain his concise and sharply sardonic style. I want to contrast this style with an evolved version of the other, more colorful and emotional strand, and analyze that artifice for a moment at the second strand. We have no serious archive of speeches. I'm told that the University of Pennsylvania is trying, through its Digital Humanities Initiative, to produce a kind of archive of speech, a speech archive for South Asia. But it hasn't started yet. So, so I want to, after the election of the United Front government in 1967, leftists enjoyed an euphoric moment. We have no serious archive of speeches, and I'll be forced to describe them to you from unreliable personal memory. One astonishingly stupefying moment for me was in the first meeting celebrating the victory in a vast sort of mass demonstration and meeting in the Maidan, in the center of Calcutta, which graphically reflected the immense emotive impact that an occasion like this can have on politicians. Prafullo Ghosh, a relatively colorless politician who was not a member of a leftist party, I think he was a member of the Bangla Congress. Partha would be able to tell me if I'm wrong, but I think he was a member of the Bangla Congress. He was not a member of the leftist party, got so carried away by the ambient revolutionary spirit of the moment that in a cascading set of reassurances, he was promising one thing after the other. He also promised to abolish money. So I was in that meeting and I was suitably impressed and stupefied at the same time. I don't think this was hard. This is the real point. I think I interpreted it wrongly. I don't think this was heard by his vast audience as a promise, unlike me. I've not said much about the saridayas of political speech. I'm using a term from Kashmiri, philosophical aesthetic. The saridaya is somebody who is a real interpreter or the real taker of poetry. So that he is also poetic, and that's why he can actually take the full meaning of the poetic quality of the poem. So I haven't said much about the saridayas of political speech, because you have to be a saridaya. The listening individuals whose minds are perfectly tuned musical instruments on whose strings the elements of the speech resonate. But the fact that no one noticed it discreetly as a governmental promise showed that the audience knew the rules of listening and I did not. We were listening to a poetry of the moment, not the prose of government accounting. His audience heard this appropriately as a high rhetoric in which the semantic values of words are transformed and turned into a kind of vague musical resonance within which the mundanely semantic value of words are drowned and obliterated. It was wrong to take it as a promise. It was a dream. This is the sense in which rhetoric is often viewed as empty, but it's obviously very powerful. I want to refer to another exemplary speaker as my last example, Hare Krishna Konar, whom I happen to know personally quite well, partly because he was a friend of my father's, and secondly because my father was in prison for about a year, and the prisoners had a day for meeting their relatives, and we had the meeting on the same day. Although he was an ordinarily likable and amiable individual, a strange transformation seized him when he got to the speaking stage, which he did quite often. His speech was undiluted theatre. He selected his themes and arguments carefully. There were a few well-chosen main points, like Congress misrule or corruption, or the heartlessness of the bourgeoisie at the obvious wretchedness and poverty around them. The arguments were stated clearly and harshly in a few sentences at the start, but each was followed by a few minute segment of theatre. Using the repertoire of the highly popular form of the village theatre, which is called Jatra, where actors have to perform on an open stage with crowds all around, and not a proscenium in which there's a structured relation between a stage and an audience in front, like here. What I remember was the great changes in the modulation of the voice, the changes in tone when he played the Congress politician, or the exploiting merchant, or the communist revolutionary. So he became each one of these characters, by turns, who were all living theatrical characters playing many parts in the Indian human comedy that was played out in every speech. We could see credibly how the minister's comportment and voice changed into the profiteers or the landowners, and how the leftist radical mounted this stage to challenge them. I wish somebody writes a book on Bengali oratory and the revolutionary aesthetic, which actually imitates what Barney has done so incomparably for Tamil oratory. Already in this discussion, we glimpse deep complexities in the place of oratory in politics, its connection to both upheavals of hope and a dark thread towards its opponents. Tagore's reflections on the rise of mass politics in the Swadeshi movement ended in an unforgettable moment of metaphor when the hero goes out to face a mob brought to a frenzy by demagogues. That mob is likened to a gigantic, sightless reptile which slithers through the town and devours whoever comes in front of him without any judgment. The power of oratory is seen as split between these two possibilities. So I want to end with a short section on what I would like to develop as oratory and presence. Now, you need not fear that this is not a discussion about the metaphysics of presence in Heidegger and things like that. In important cases of oratorical performance, we are presented with a combination of the spectacular and the discursive. We make a mistake if we see the occasion as consisting in or being dependent on the discursive alone. So what I'm trying to say is that oratory, the spectacular, is more dominant in oratory than the meaning side of speeches. We make a mistake if we see the occasion as consisting in or being dependent on the discursive alone, the ability of the political figure to persuade or sway the audience by the force of the argument. It's essential to stress that in many of these cases, what happens is not an instance where people come with a blank, curious mind and are moved by the adventitious argumentative performance of the speaker. In such appearances, there is precisely no accident or adventitiousness. When people come to a scene of a speech, the persuasion or conviction has already taken place. In a certain sense, the argument actually precedes the speaker. I wrote in a paper a very long time back something about Gandhi, and I feel that in our darker times, it is also true of other political figures like Modi or Trump. I said that he began to be understood before he began to speak. So I'm afraid that that is also true of audiences today. So when people come to a scene of a speech, the persuasion or conviction has already taken place. Oratory in this sense is deeply intricated with this complex phenomenon of what I can only call political presence. Just as in films, people go to see a film by, let's say, Amitabh Bachchan, carrying inside themselves what I can call in a slightly grander language, a kind of force structure of the understanding. There's a structure of expectation that the film actors or orators have to satisfy. By repeated uses of their dramaturgic properties, individual actors slowly establish a theatrical or cinematic persona, an action hero, a tragic heroine, a romantic lead, a villain. When spectators go to a movie of this kind, they carry with them a determinate structure of expectation. They do not go with an open mind to see how the great actor will act in a role which is still unspecified. In a clear reversal, they do not really go to see the film with the actor in it, but they go to see the actor in a film that is subordinate to his presence. The world of political persuasion has become saturated and restructured by influences and causalities originating from the world of visual images, reflected in Trump caps or Modi masks. The crowds who come to their rallies do not want to hear a speech. They want primarily to be part of a spectacle. In a bizarre reversal, the speech does not need to be heard. It has been heard many times before, in a strange and mysterious way, which we do not yet understand fully, at least I do not, because we haven't given it close attention as part of our study of politics. These figures become images in a true sense, abstracted from their real personalities, carrying a highly condensed but highly effective form of political ideals, ideas, arguments, scraps of policies. But these are much more capable of the dark function of oratory, the rhetoric of division and hatred, alleged memories of ancient enmities and injustice. We tend to be puzzled by the success of this kind of politics. To understand them, we must give more attention not to the content, but to the form, not to the deep meanings of the arguments, but the lucid provocation of insults which lie right at the surface. We must be good at reading the surface of language, where a major part of the meaning happens. Bernard Bate was an excellent reader of these parts of language. In my tribute to Barney, I want to stress that even politics that I find repugnant has an aesthetics. It's an essential part of analyzing politics to grasp how that aesthetic function works. Thank you.